The aircraft carrier is the biggest war machine the world has ever known. Over its 90-year history, the aircraft carrier has evolved into the most powerful and most flexible warship the world has ever seen. Since World War II, the U.S. Navy has been the greatest carrier power. Carrier battle groups have seen action everywhere, from Korea and Vietnam to the Arabian Gulf and Afghanistan. America has continued to invest heavily in carrier technology and has an active fleet of 12 supercarriers. Each of these can project massive firepower over a large part of the world's surface without any need for land bases. Carriers can respond to any situation, from fleet battles to all-out nuclear war. And they can do far more. Their flexibility has been shown in disaster relief, civilian evacuation, and peacekeeping missions. A carrier's firepower, mobility, and flexibility provide the frontline forces in the war against terror. It plays a vital role in the modern world. The U.S. Navy was a pioneer in the race to take aircraft to sea. In 1910, Eugene Ely made the first takeoff from a ship, the armored cruiser Pennsylvania. The following year, Ely made the first landing on a ship, but few took the success as anything more than a publicity stunt. Opinions changed with the outbreak of World War I. Most navies saw the scouting potential of aircraft. They mounted flying-off platforms on battleships. The aircraft were used mainly for observation and to spot for the big guns of the battleships. Dedicated seaplane carriers were in service by 1916, but it was soon clear that land planes offered a much better performance than float planes or flying boats. But taking land planes to sea called for a brand new kind of ship, the aircraft carrier. The British carried out the first experiments, fitting a flying-off deck onto the bow of the light battlecruiser Furious. The arrangement was awkward. Furious was later converted into a conventional carrier. In 1918, she was followed into service by the world's first true flat-top ship, the HMS Argus. U.S. battleships served with the British in the last year of the First World War, and American commanders were quick to see the value of naval aircraft. In 1922, at the end of the war, the U.S. Navy ordered the large collier Jupiter, a coal transporter, to be converted into America's first carrier, the USS Langley. Nicknamed the Covered Wagon, Langley was flush-decked with two hinged funnels on the port side. But she could only reach 14 knots, some 7 knots less than the speed of the battle fleet. In spite of this handicap, she provided valuable experience in carrier operations. One of her most important roles was to test different systems of arrestor gear, the equipment that helped airplanes land and stop. When Langley was first commissioned, she had a British system of wires along the deck. These were intended to engage hooks in the landing gear of the aircraft to slow it and prevent it from slewing from side to side. But landing an aircraft on a moving ship remained a difficult art, and not all efforts were successful. The U.S. Navy added a backup system of cross-deck wires. Refined into a proper hydraulic arrestor system, this was much more effective. It became the standard for all modern carrier landing gear. Another innovation was a pair of flush-mounted pneumatic catapults on the flight deck. These were intended to launch seaplanes. They later proved effective in launching land planes. And like the arrestor gear, the catapult is still standard on today's U.S. Navy carriers. The 1922 Washington Treaty was designed to prevent a repeat of the ruinous warship building race that had come before World War I. No new battleships could be built, but the treaty placed few restrictions on the building of aircraft carriers. The powers, the US, United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, France, and Italy were allowed to convert 2 larger capital ships. The Americans had 2 very large battlecruisers under construction. The USS Lexington and the USS Saratoga were monsters. Despite measuring over 890 feet, they were capable of speeds of 34 knots. They were supposed to be limited to 33,000 tons, but they were 3,000 tons heavier. Known as the Lexingtons, a convention naming ships after the first of their class, they were expected to defend themselves against enemy surface ships. They carried a heavy cruiser's armaments with 8 8-inch guns in twin turrets, forward and aft. And their large size allowed each to carry over 80 aircraft. The aircraft themselves had evolved from the early scouts and observation aircraft into sophisticated fighting machines. The Lexingtons carried single-seat fighters, 2-seat scout airplanes, and torpedo bombers. From 1928, Lexington and Saratoga served with the battleships, where they took part in the annual Fleet Problem, or war game of the Pacific Fleet. But they also experimented with ways of using the air groups in war games against each other. This laid the foundation for the tactics used successfully by the U.S. carriers in World War II. In spite of such success, U.S. Navy planners were still unsure of the way forward. Many thought that the Lexingtons were too big. As a result, the next carrier to be commissioned was the USS Ranger in 1934, and it was much smaller. In fact, the U.S. Navy's first purpose-built aircraft carrier was too small. Bigger was better. USS Yorktown was the lead ship of the next class of aircraft carrier. She and her sister, Enterprise, were commissioned in 1937 and 38 and were followed by the Hornet 3 years later. Their design was based on that of the Ranger, but much larger. The Yorktowns had an open hangar rather than the closed type of the Lexington and Saratoga. This allowed them to carry the same 80 aircraft air group on a smaller platform. The 3 Yorktowns took up most of the carrier tonnage allowed under the Washington Treaty, 135,000 tons for the U.S. But there were nearly 15,000 tons left over. This permitted the construction of a new light carrier, the USS Wasp. It could still carry a large air group, but the Wasp was slow and lacked adequate protection. Despite having a potent force of 6 carriers, the U.S. Navy's High Command still firmly believed in the power of the battleship. The carriers were largely viewed as a support. America's involvement in the war was to change that idea totally. In the Pacific, Axis forces in the shape of the Imperial Japanese Navy faced the strength of the Allies at sea. From the moment the Japanese struck at the U.S. Pacific Fleet's anchorage, the 7th of December, 1941, a new era in naval warfare was born. Pearl Harbor was the dawn of carrier warfare across the oceans. The Pacific War was largely the war of the carrier. It was the effective use of carrier task forces from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa that proved decisive. America's reliance on the carrier was a matter of necessity. Most of the battleships that the aircraft carriers were meant to support were now sunk or disabled. For the first time, battles were fought with hundreds of miles of ocean between the combatants. For at least 6 months, the U.S. Pacific Fleet could only take offensive action with its carriers. This is how the concept of the Fast Carrier Task Force emerged. The Air Group's dive bombers and torpedo bombers were used as long-range substitutes for the 16-inch gun. The Doolittle raid in April 1942 had an importance out of all proportion to its military effect. Commanded by pioneer aviator Jimmy Doolittle, a small force of U.S. Army Air Force Mitchell bombers was launched from the USS Hornet. Their target was Tokyo, and the few bombs which actually hit the Japanese capital were an omen of the devastating raids to come. The first major battle in the Coral Sea was fought in May 1942. It was intended to stop the advancing Japanese from gaining a foothold in southern New Guinea. The Japanese lost their small carrier, Shoho. The battle cost the Americans one of their biggest carriers, Lexington. Nevertheless, the U.S. Navy succeeded in its aim, and the Japanese operation was called off. A rash attempt by the Japanese to capture Midway Island brought on the next battle in June 1942. Superior American intelligence and much improved tactics made the Battle of Midway decisive. In exchange for the Yorktown, which was sunk by Japanese aircraft and submarines, the Japanese lost 4 frontline carriers to American dive bombers. It was the end of imperial expansion. From here onwards, Japan would be on the defensive. The Japanese Imperial Navy may have been crippled, but it wasn't finished yet. The Americans lost another 2 carriers, the Wasp and the Hornet, when the Allies took the offensive by landing in the bitterly contested Solomon Islands. Despite severe damage from 9 torpedoes, Hornet remained afloat and was later finished off by torpedoes from American ships. Increasing Allied air superiority thinned the ranks of the Imperial naval pilots to a fatal degree. The battles of the Eastern Solomons and the Santa Cruz Islands hammered another nail into the coffin for the Japanese. The U.S. Navy could replace its losses with thousands of new aircrew. A new generation of more powerful aircraft was also entering service. Above all, it was the commissioning of the Essex-class carriers that decisively swung the balance of power in the Pacific. Based on the Yorktown class, but larger, the Essex-class vessels could carry more than 80 aircraft. By using outriggers to save space on deck, their air groups could be increased in size, and by the end of the war, the Essexes were regularly carrying more than 100 aircraft. Over the next year, carriers supported America's island-hopping advances through the Central Pacific. Only the enormous industrial capacity of the United States could have produced the carrier task forces which would break the Japanese fleet. Along with the large Essex class, there were also light fleet carriers. Based on light cruiser hulls, these had the speed to keep up with the task forces. They were never more than a temporary measure until construction of the Essex class got into top gear. Fleet carriers were not the whole story. Nearly 80 escort carriers were built in just 3 years. Based on merchant ship hulls, these tiny jeep carriers provided vital anti-submarine cover to the amphibious forces and resupply convoys. They were also important as aircraft transports during the advance on Japan. They proved highly effective in the Atlantic, where they formed the core of hunter-killer groups directed against the German U-boats. In June 1944, the U.S. assault on the Marianas Islands brought about another great carrier battle. American fighters and the fleet's anti-aircraft guns slaughtered hundreds of semi-skilled Japanese pilots over the Philippine Sea. When 4 months later, the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy were flung into the Battle of Leyte Gulf, there were hardly any trained pilots left. The battle saw the first use of kamikaze or suicide attacks by the Japanese. Their primary targets were the U.S. Navy's carriers. Well placed, a kamikaze could devastate even a large Essex. They inflicted serious damage, but these desperate tactics came too late for the Japanese. The Pacific War showed decisively that the carrier had become the dominant weapon on the high seas. Even as they basked in their triumph, the carriers that won the Pacific War were in danger of becoming obsolete. The jet engine had come into widespread service since 1945. Early experimental naval jet fighters were paving the way for more capable frontline varieties. But their operation would demand new advances in technology, advances that would take some years to perfect. In the meantime, the U.S. Navy could still field 15 Essex-class carriers, plus 3 of the new, large Midway class. The first of these had been launched at the end of World War II. Many of the carriers had been in reserve when the Navy was next called to action, in Korea. The communist attack on South Korea in 1950 caught the world by surprise. The first United Nations air assets to reach the war zone were American and British carriers. As the UN forces were nearly pushed off the Korean peninsula, carrier air power became the only way to strike back. Piston-engined aircraft bore the brunt of early operations. But soon they were joined by the first jets, like the Grumman Panther. The U.S. Navy's aircraft proved highly effective during the Korean War. They flew reconnaissance missions and provided valuable close support for United Nations troops on the ground. They also carried out successful strike missions against targets in the north, all thanks to their carriers. With the outbreak of the Cold War in 1946, the U.S. Navy's priority was to counter the rapidly rising Soviet nuclear threat. Korea had shown that the World War II-era carriers had limitations. Operating the new jet aircraft off carriers posed new problems. Jet fighters like the Fury, Cougar, and Cutlass were much faster and heavier than piston-engine fighters. To accommodate the jets, a number of innovations, all devised by the British, were incorporated into American carrier designs in the 1950s and 1960s. By far the most important of these was the angled flight deck. In effect, straight deck carriers had only one active runway. Aircraft could either be launched or landed, but not at the same time. By angling the landing area to one side, incoming aircraft could have an unobstructed approach. The forward part of the deck could be left free for parking or for launching aircraft. This change also removed the risk of aircraft collisions during landing operations. High jet speeds made the old system of controlling approach by watching a bat-waving landing officer impractical. The new solution was a landing system using mirrors and lights. This visual aid could be seen at a long distance by an incoming pilot. He could judge for himself whether or not his approach altitude was correct. By the mid-1950s, new carrier-based nuclear bombers were entering service. These had been developed to allow the U.S. Navy to play its part in providing America's Cold War nuclear deterrent. These large aircraft, the H-A Savage, the A-3 Sky Warrior, and the A-5 Vigilante, weighed up to 30 tons each. It was realized that something more powerful than the hydraulic catapults then in use was needed to launch these heavyweight jets. The solution universally adopted was the steam catapult, which drew power from the ship's boilers. The device could catapult a 30-ton jet bomber to flying speed in 300 feet. A very big ship was needed to carry up to 4 of these long, powerful catapults. And the Essex-class carriers were too small. The new generation of nuclear jet bombers first went to sea on the USS Forrestal. Commissioned in 1955, this first attack aircraft carrier had many design features of the United States, a project to design a radical new carrier that was canceled owing to Air Force opposition. The Forrestal was hugely influential, introducing the basic hull form and deck arrangements for all subsequent U.S. Navy supercarriers. Displacing over 75,000 tons fully loaded, she was the largest warship in the world. Her flight deck was just under 1,000 feet long and over 250 feet wide. She could carry an air wing of over 90 aircraft. Forrestal was quickly followed by 3 sister ships, all commissioned by 1959. These were followed by 4 carriers in the Kitty Hawk class. These were all built to a modified Forrestal design with minor improvements. But even as the Kitty Hawk was entering service in 1961, the future of the American carrier was being transformed by the arrival of the USS Enterprise. Commissioned in 1961, Enterprise took the U.S. Navy into the atomic age. She was built to the same general layout as Forrestal, but was enlarged to make room for 8 nuclear reactors. These gave the carrier virtually unlimited range. The U.S. Navy's force of large carriers had been built up quickly through the 1950s to counter the growing threat from the Soviet Navy. Although powerful, the Soviet surface fleet was no match for the U.S. Navy. The biggest threat in time of war would have come from the massive Soviet submarine force. In response, the Navy re-rolled its older, smaller Essex carriers for anti-submarine warfare. The deployment of the supercarriers led to a change in American doctrine. With their large carrier air wings, supercarriers allowed the United States to project massive power on a truly global scale. They became the symbols of U.S. influence and were used to provide an American presence in times of crisis. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, several carriers were deployed to maintain a naval blockade. But even as U.S. sailors and airmen were training for all-out nuclear war on America's doorstep, the United States was becoming embroiled in a more limited, conventional war in Southeast Asia. The American carrier force played a major part in the Vietnam War, from the Tonkin Gulf incident in 1964 to the final evacuation from Saigon. Yankee Station in the South China Sea became the U.S. Navy's main operational location for strikes against North Vietnam. When U.S. combat operations stopped, 17 carriers made a total of 73 combat cruises and spent over 8,000 days on the line. The aircraft they used ranged from simple prop-driven machines, like the Douglas A-1 Skyraider, to the most sophisticated weapon systems of their time. Shipboard attack aircraft, like the A-4 Skyhawk, supported friendly troops locked in ground combat with the Viet Cong, or struck targets in the north. The all-weather A-6 Intruder, with a 2-man crew,